Western leaders fiddle in Rome while Ukraine burns. What we have here is just some really crazy stuff, and some the juxtaposition about what people are saying and what's actually happening on the ground are so dramatically different. It's just hard to fathom. I mean, we're really into some George Orwell 1984 kind of vibes here. And you would never know it if you only listen to what's going on at the highest levels in Europe, especially among some of the European leaders, with Zelensky, Giorgia Meloni, Merz, etc., all of which we're going to talk about today. And we're going to try and unpack some of this stuff. We have one of our favorite guests on, retired Commodore Steve Jermy from the United Kingdom, who's joining us here live from his home. What was the town there, by the way, Steve? I can't remember now.
We're in a town called close to Falmouth, so you've got one of those in the States. But it was very good to see you and your wife and son up in London recently.
It really was absolutely. I still have such fond memories of that, and I want to get back. Y'all should come visit us, by the way, one of these days. We'd love to have you and host you here in Washington D.C. But I should. We should pass along some of that. It was so enjoyable. But I'm glad to have you here. It's better than not having anything at all. Yeah, sure. Listen, I just kind of want your thoughts first of all, just on the concept here of this rebuilding situation, this conference in Rome today, because almost all the speakers kept mentioning the Marshall Plan. They said, we have to get something like what happened at the end of World War II to where we're going to rebuild and all this stuff. And they're talking details. Here's the thing. The Marshall Plan was started in 1948, 3 years after the end of the Second World War. And now here these guys from a position of losing a war are talking about reconstruction as though there's some reality to it. How do you see it?
I mean, I think it feels ridiculous to me, Danny, because where are we? We're trying to think about construction, as you say, before the war's even finished. And the fundamental question is, who's going to pay? Who is going to pay? I mean, George Marshall, whose autobiography I read some time ago, it was a biography actually, had a fine mind and a very interesting man. And, in 1948, they did it because they could see that without it, then there was a danger that Europe would fall under the rule of the communists. So you can understand why it was done. And of course, which was the richest country in the world by far and the most economically productive? It was America. So America was in a very good position to do it. But if you look now at all of the players in this, on our side, shall I say, or on the NATO side, I can't think of a single country in Europe on this side of the pond that is anything other than in pretty bad financial state. And, it's not as if things are a perfect situation over in the States. So the question is, who's going to pay? And the question is, what will be, I think the much more interesting question is, where will the reconstruction take place? Because it certainly won't be in places like Donetsk and Luhansk, which will already have been done with the Russians and will no longer be part of Ukraine, the way things are going. So, it may be cheaper because actually there isn't much left of Ukraine to actually.
Well, I guess when you look at it from
reconstruct.
And let's listen here. Let's start off with Volodymyr Zelensky, because this was also, and I don't have this part of the clip here, but when he strode to the lectern, there was all these heads of state in, that's from Germany, France, Italy, several other places, all in attendance right there on the front row of this thing. And when they announced Zelensky, it was like a rock star had come into the room. The place just erupted into this long, open, applause, standing ovation. I don't know if it was standing ovation, but it was a long period of applause. And I was already thinking, this is the guy who's unwilling to see reality, that is leading his country to destruction instead of taking the many diplomatic off-ramps that have been offered. And he's still going on with this issue that's totally disconnected from reality. That was the setup here. Here's what he actually said.
A systematic approach is needed, a coalition with clear leadership, countries and companies that can lead and bring others with them. And we also need a clear recovery plan. Think of the role the Marshall Plan played in rebuilding and transforming Europe. That's why Europe has enjoyed peace and economic growth for so many decades. And now we have real opportunity to spark a new wave of progress. We need a making sure our people are protected. I also thank Italy, more than 500 companies, Georgia, thank you so much, and to your team, more than 500 companies are represented here at the conference. Around 200 agreements are ready to be signed with a total value of over 10 billion euros. All of these must be fully implemented. And please, let's also focus on energy.
Okay. You have allegedly 500 companies that are ready to do business, 200 deals which are already just waiting to be signed, and we have this reconstruction plan. But Commodore, don't you first have to worry about getting the war over with before any of these can be done?
I think it'd be helpful. I don't fancy doing reconstruction in the middle of a Oreshnik attack, would you, Danny? I can't say that I would. It's comical, I'm afraid. It's comical, and I think the standing ovation was equally comical. But to me, it shows the lack of judgment, the lack of strategic judgment across Europe in our strategic leaders. It is obvious to me. It's obvious to you. It's obvious to others. You just keep gentle track of what's going on the battlefield. And the best way I've heard described it recently is the lava flow of the Russian army is marching west, and I can see no sense of it reducing. And although Trump has said that he'll provide some defensive weapons, he seems to be zigzagging. He may be a very good naval officer in that respect, but he's zigzagging. But when you look at the things that he's excluded, PAC-3 Patriot missiles, 155 millimeter shells, GMLRS rockets, and I could go on. I mean, essentially, he's essentially starting to reduce, in real terms, his military support to Ukraine. So although he's talking tough, he's actually reducing it. We had a conversation about 3 months ago where I said that Trump's options were to step out, step in, or peter out. And essentially what America is doing is petering out. And I think what they want to do is I honestly don't think he's interested in the war. It's a pain, it's Biden's war. And what he really wants to do is hand it off to the Europeans and, perhaps with a bit of support while he can get on with the things that are more important to him, like Israel, Iran, like China, and the other things that are going on. So, no, I'm not stunned, but I'm very disappointed in the European leaders. Very disappointed.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. You can't be surprised anymore. I mean, just the things just you and I talk about on this show alone is enough to show that there's some consistency, unfortunately, between a lot of this disconnected from reality, is this dystopian. It maybe is a better term. The host of this event here in Rome was Giorgia Meloni, and she had a commentary which I thought on the surface of it voices a reasonable aspiration for what you want to accomplish, but then there's some problems on the execution.
The work that we are doing to enable Kyiv to restart economically and to rebuild what has been destroyed by more than 3 years of senseless war is an integral part of the efforts that we discuss in this table. It is a long-term investment in a future of peace, stability, security, sovereignty, prosperity.
I mean, who wouldn't want peace, security, and prosperity for their countries? I mean, that's certainly what everybody wants. But the question has to be asked. You can't disconnect it from even a casual look at the battlefield, as you said, and believe that this is a path to get to prosperity and peace instead of going down a different path where you acknowledge reality. So how do you account for that disconnect from the aspiration to the policies that they're pursuing?
Yeah, it's really difficult to try and put it together and think what's going on, Gary, even in a sort of really weird way of thinking that most of the Europeans appear to be doing. I mean, I have said for some time, I think I said in the very first show when we talked, that the Europeans have been guided by, or the West and NATO have been guided by a political narrative, and Russia's been guided by a military strategy. And we can see the results of the Russian military strategy and their success and increasing success on the battlefield. What we're seeing is if we think Trump's zigzagging, then my goodness me, look at the Europeans. We've been talking about things that we would do with Russia, and things that we wouldn't do with Russia. But the point about reconstruction, I think it feels to me like almost a some sort of, I don't think it's meant as deception, but it comes across as deception. Things are going very badly on the battlefield, so let's work out how to rebuild what's left of Ukraine after it's been destroyed.
Well, I mean, that's the question I have is that how can any of those things that she talked about there, or any of the other speakers, how can they be manifest if they're going to go, if the Ukraine army is going to lose, and any rational person can see that they're not, it's impossible for them to win. And if the European states go bankrupt trying to get the unattainable attained, I mean, there's going to come a position somewhere where the fiction can no longer be maintained, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think actually, because what the Europeans are doing, they're trying to support. They're talking now about reconstruction, another sense of money. The last thing, of course, is they're actually going to increase their defence spending to 5% of GDP. You know, I mean, if you want to put difficulty on top of difficulty in a European region, which is generally speaking struggling, I would say that Germany, we think, is in recession. I would say this country is in recession. France isn't good. You haven't got great unity amongst the European leaders. So it's trying to do something almost impossible. It's I'm trying to think of a metaphor. It's like trying to jump back into the Titanic and work out how we're going to do all the damage control and sort it out with a shovel and a spade. I mean, it's not going to work, is it? I think what we'll find though, Danny, is that this may be deception because they're saying to themselves, we're losing this war. We need to actually find out something else. It may be, I don't know. But what I think we'll find is that as the Russians continue forward and it becomes clear that they are going to achieve the objectives that they've set themselves at the outset, and they've repeated to us time and again, then it'll become clear that actually to lots of general people around Europe, that this is not only this is a waste, but it turns to be a terrible use of European money at a time when the last thing they want to do is use European money in this way.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna get to that in just a second. I've got a soundbite from somebody in Europe saying very similar to what you just said there. So obviously there's a lot thinking that way. But let me go first of all to the German Chancellor, the new Chancellor Merz, because he's talking about he wants. And I don't get this part at all. You can have this fiction that you want Ukraine to win, just an aspiration, and a narrative, as you put it a second ago. But when he says he wants the full integration of Ukraine into Europe, I got to ask, what?
When you visited me in Berlin in May, a couple of weeks ago, we agreed to take the defense industrial cooperation between our two countries to a higher level. These measures underline our confidence in Ukraine's future. And here is a second lever able to turn Ukraine's reconstruction into the economic miracle we all hope to see. That lever is Ukraine's successful European integration. To be very clear on this, we fully support Ukraine on its path to EU membership.
Okay, just as a reminder to those who may not be tracking, prior to the onset of this war, of every nation in Europe, the most corrupt was Ukraine. Nobody wanted them in the EU before that. Why in God's name now, when they have been systematically destroyed and now cut in pieces, would there be this, again, this loud clapping and these applause to bring them into the European Union? Why would they want that albatross around their neck?
Again, I think it's a wonderful book about how crowds get seduced into investment. It's called The Madness of Crowds. This is the madness of crowds. This is a set of people who are still bought into the narrative, and they're through that buy-in to a narrative which is self-evidently has no reaction, no reality, no connection now to reality. They're supporting something which is bound to end in failure. It is bound to end in failure. I'm surprised as well that some of the more canny politicians can't see this. There are one or two, in Hungary we can see it, and There are one or two others in the Balkans starting to think about it. But for the majority, they're actually putting themselves in an even more embarrassing situation than they already are. It's clear to anybody with a good military brain on their head, or even an average military brain, right, that Russia's going to win. So the idea that we're going to start reconstructing Ukraine, there's no doubt that it does need. But I think what we'll find is that the people who are going to be doing the majority of reconstruction of Ukraine will be the Russians in the areas that they've secured. They have the resources to do it. They have the money to do it. They clearly have the industrial production to do it. Europe, broadly speaking, like America, offshore a lot of its industrial capacity. So that's not going to help with reconstruction, is it? So I think the regions that are come under Russian, finally at the end of the war, and I think that's a very interesting question, what those might look like. But the regions that come under Russia are the ones that will prosper. And I suspect that the rump Ukraine state will struggle. By all means, and I'd be curious to see what the Russians think about it, because of course they're now increasingly putting together the EU and NATO, and for very good reasons. But even if they accept Ukraine's adoption into NATO, into Ukraine, how will that look? How will you get through the difficulties that, for example, Turkey, which is a much more robust state, has still not been able to enter the EU,
right,
about it. And suddenly the most corrupt state in Europe is pivoted in. How will that look? It looks about as hypocritical as you can imagine. So
that's one that you don't want to succeed there, because if you bring them in, wow, that's just that's more of the bizarre stuff.
Yeah,
and this is happening in the context of Russia continued to advance on the battlefield, or physically on the battle lines, especially in the Zaporizhia, the Pokrovsk area, the Kupiansk area, now a new place in the Kharkiv area, and still in the Sumy process as well. So that's all happening on the ground at the same time that the drone strikes have been dramatically increasing from the Russian side. And actually, then just before we had the show here, I interviewed George Mamsarov, who's a former soldier on the Russian army and now a journalist on the front lines in Zaporizhia right now. He came to us live from the battlefront in that area. And I asked him specifically about that. And he said, listen, we have been working for the last 6 or so months as a country at the national level to be able to get our production level up to where we can maintain this level of attacks almost indefinitely. He said, we now have more than enough stockpiles to maintain the stuff that, like you're seeing on the screen there, in these 700, 500 per night. And by some reports, they could get up to 1,000 per night. But he said they can sustain this nearly indefinitely, which is just a stunning situation. And for in the process, enough wreckage of this kind of stuff to be talking about how that you're going to, have reconstruction, which of course every day there's more things to reconstruct, like you see on the screen here. And the Russians are pushing on the line. And he also said, and it's very important, he said I asked him about this conference that we're talking about now. He said, we just laugh about it. He said, we just mock it because it's like it's so disconnected from reality, and we're just ignoring what they say, and we're just marching on forward. So, like you said, if you had a half of a minuscule of a military brain, you could see the fundamentals here just are screaming against you, but they don't. So why?
Yeah. Again, it's the madness of crowds. It's also the Western media. The Western media are extraordinary. I mean, what's very curious is that I track the media. I don't read a newspaper every day. But it was being very quiet in the British media, and I suspect it's quiet because they're actually realizing the way this is going. When you come to what the Russians are doing, it's not just on the battlefield, as you say, but it's actually the strategic bombardment. So this is a strategic bombardment campaign that they can keep going in a way which would have been difficult without the sorts of capacity they've got. I mean, the Second World War, if you think back to I think it was the 8th Air Force and the Bomber Command, we maintained a strategic bombardment campaign against Germany, but that was extremely costly. I think 55,000 aircrew were killed during that. It was a big figure. and lots of people were lost in it. And there was open questions about the morality of some of that campaign, but that's for another day. But here we've got a strategic bombardment campaign, where they're starting to increase the amount of targets. So I've always thought that they would target energy infrastructure. I've always thought that they would target industrial capacity. They're targeting recruiting centers now. And slowly but surely, they'll take apart the Russian economy. As soon as you take apart a country's energy infrastructure and you take its industrial capacity apart, that is the key element of power. So sooner or later, you just can't keep going. So soldiers on the battlefield will not get the logistics they need. Anything that's to do with logistics and maintaining the front line will be targeted. I'm absolutely certain of it. And I think the only question is how long Ukraine lasts, how long they last, and where the Russians eventually end up.
The George Mamsarov we interviewed also said another interesting on that point, which I found fascinating. He was remarkably open and frank, by the way. He was not just like spouting off Kremlin talking points or whatever, but he was telling the truth as he sees it down there. And one of the things he said was, I asked him, I said, I thought maybe a year ago, I thought maybe by the end of the summer of 2024, the Ukraine army might just crumble and collapse. And I said, yet here we are, and a year later, and they still aren't. So the question is, will they ever collapse? And he said, well, you got to understand something. He said, the Ukrainians are our Slavic brothers and, cousins, whatever. He said, so we're kind of from the same stock. And he said, and we will fight to the death. He said, the Ukraine side, some of the times they fight the hardest when they're outnumbered and when they're surrounded, et cetera. They just don't quit. And he said, and we give props to them. We recognize that too. So he said, we are operating on the assumption that they're not going to break anywhere, and we may have to just methodically just continue on fighting and destroying their capacity until they just don't have it. But he said that they are just this fierce fighter that just don't know how to quit, no matter how big the odds are. And that's good on the one hand, because you can, say loud that and say, what great fighting spirit. But the downside of that is that prolongs the war and increases the destruction of Ukraine. So I'm not sure that's such a good thing in that situation.
No, I mean, we've seen this before, haven't we? If you think about the Japanese and the Germans, I mean, the German army was exceptional.
Great point.
Great point. With the Japanese, they never gave up either. But what do we end? It didn't make an ultimate difference. It just meant that we were a little bit more careful the way we conducted the war, and the way the Russians conducted the war. Let's not forget that actually in Europe, it was the Russians who were the predominant force and took on and defeated the German army. So I think that's the situation the Ukrainians find themselves in. You cannot help at the tactical level but admire their fighting capability. I'm not entirely surprised. We've seen, I think they used to say with the German army, there were three things in life: death, taxes, and the German counterattack. And you sort of see that in Ukraine as well, don't you? With the sort of they do counterattack, but sooner or later, the power of industrial capacity, the power of energy, and the power of the overwhelming advantage that the Russians have is going to make a difference. It doesn't matter how brave you are and how courageous the teams are, they are going to lose. I think the interesting thing, I'm just slightly, I think we've seen a little bit, and I think Doug McGregor occasionally talks about this, about people, especially families, not wanting their people to go to the front line and trying to avoid that, and there being challenges to the press gangs. And it's whether or not that starts to have some wider impact, and whether or not security services in Ukraine can continue to suppress that. But sooner or later, what the fall looks like, from the sound of it, I, like you, I'm wondering whether there would be a collapse. I don't see signs of that, but what I see is retreat on all areas of the battlefield where the Russians choose to advance. And that might not be a collapse, but you achieve the same thing, just not quite as quickly.
He did tell me, by the way, that, and again, this is pretty frank and open stuff. He said that Pokrovsk is the priority of effort for the Russians. They have an offensive going on in Zaporizhia, another one in Kupiansk, which are supporting elements, but the main focus is on the Pokrovsk, because they feel like if they can get that cut off, whether surrounded or defeated, they think they can unhinge the entire front lines. And he said they do have sufficient operational reserves ready to exploit that and to get through. So we'll see how that transpires, something we're going to keep watching here. Getting back to this situation here, you mentioned a second ago that some in Europe are not keen on having all their money going into basically a bottomless pit of just being thrown away into the trash by giving to Ukraine. One of those, we just showed you Chancellor Merz talking about he wants full integration of the Ukraine and giving them a bunch of stuff that he's been offering here. Everybody in Germany, however, is not so keen on that.
When push comes to shove, you brazenly and shamelessly claim there's no money. In the same breath, you offer the US president to use German taxpayers' money to buy American weapons for Ukraine. Personally, I believe you've already secured your next supervisory board position as a lobbyist, Mr. Merz. And as the crowning insult, you then condescendingly tell the German people that they need to work more.
Now, that's the leader of the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland. So you expect her not to be liking anything Merz does. But they do speak for a lot of Germans who don't like their money going to Ukraine while they themselves are doing without. Is that common among, rather better question, how widespread do you think that is among other European countries?
I mean, I think we're seeing it in different stages. So, for example, I listened recently to a really interesting podcast by a team in Holland, where the Munich conference was actually a big peace marches were run outside it. We didn't see much of it in the mainstream media because, of course, it goes against the narrative. The Spanish are clearly much less happy with the situation. Whereas others are still ploughing on regardless. I mean, unfortunately, the British, the French, and the Germans seem to be ploughing on regardless. But I do think that sooner or later, in the same way that the Russian army progresses, and as soon as cuts start to happen in critical areas of government spending, in welfare areas, in capital construction, those areas, and they have to happen, or tax rises happen, it's bound to make people think again. Because I think the other thing is that the story is starting to leak out. I mean, 2 hours ago, we sat with a guy that I've only just met, lives in my village, a master mariner, a fascinating man, and doesn't get it in the same way that you and I, because he's not been track it in the same way that we do, but totally open-minded to what he's hearing from us, and very skeptical of the position that's being portrayed amongst European countries.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's not just in Europe. It's also in the United States. I don't want to just cast a bunch of dispersions upon the European leaders without also shining a light on some in my own country here. There was some information this morning out that from Jack Keane on Fox News, and he can always be counted on to just say, hey, we just need to give more stuff to Ukraine. The President Trump, in just as kind of context here, kind of went back again on his pledge to cut off some of the support for Ukraine. Now he's going to give some more interceptor missiles. He said, I'm going to give them stuff to defend themselves with. Well, an analysis shows it's a whopping 10 interceptor missiles and a handful of other things, and then they're figuring out what else they can do. The bottom line is we don't have a lot to give, so it's not going to have any impact on the fighting here. But there are some in the United States that want President Trump, and the Washington Post was a key one, where they said he should go back to the Biden era stuff and just open all the gates and give everything so that Ukraine can, quote, defend itself, whatever that means, and they don't ever bother to figure that out. They just want more stuff to go out. Well, to try and buttress that, you had General Jack Keane go on to try to play the same card that they played really earlier in the conflict. Maybe he's going to try and replay it, which is Vladimir Putin is the devil.
He's largely targeting civilians, and he wants to put pressure on Zelensky as a result of that, to make even more concessions going forward. Putin is a defined war criminal. There is absolutely no getting around this. Not only has he committed genocide against mass population, and there's 4 different mass grave sites in different cities that reflect it, but he's targeting civilians in these cities. He targets hospitals and he targets schools. There's no accident that a school gets hit or a hospital. This is all to break the will of the Ukrainian people. The president is on to him. He's given him every chance here to work this. And what he really wants to do is get the president so frustrated, Bill and Dana, that he walks away and doesn't support Ukraine. Well, the president is frustrated. But guess what? He's not walking away.
Okay, first of all, if you want to talk about genocide and committing war crimes, you might want to look at a different world leader in a different conflict. Maybe a guy named Benjamin Netanyahu. Didn't seem to bring that guy into this talk to. But let's first of all, before we go any further on that, let's announce, do you have any knowledge about what Keen's talking about here about this alleged war crimes where there are mass graves in 4 different places that's been documented? I'm not tracking that.
No, me neither. And I think if it were true, it would be all over the press. There's none of it here in this country. It'd be all over the press because people would say, there we are. It just shows you that Putin's a war criminal. But I haven't seen a shred of evidence. And I'm sure that if there was evidence, I'd have heard from it from, for example, from Larry Johnson and, those people with good insight still. I haven't seen a shred of evidence. I also don't see why it's in Russia's interest. I mean, I think that Keen's argument that he's trying to break the will of the people isn't true. I mean, actually, the Russians, compared to, for example, the Israelis, as you pointed out, have had a very, very low set level of civilian casualties in proportionate terms, and a very low level of civilian casualties compared to the Americans and the British and others in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So the idea that he's trying to deliberately do it, in fact, my strong suspicion, I have no evidence of this, is that he's trying to do the opposite. He's trying deliberately not to target them, and that he's been very careful. I think the fact that we're seeing more attacks now is a result of the foolish attack on the Russian strategic bombers. I think as a result of that, and the change to an anti-terrorist campaign now, what he's trying to do is to win the war possibly a little bit more quickly. But certainly I think the key thing is that it's clear to me that he is determined to win this war militarily. If it happens that something else throws up and we get a good diplomatic deal, I can't see any sign of it. And his situation, I'd be incredibly suspicious of any offer from the West. He's going to win it on the battlefield. I suspect that he's told his armed forces, I think I might have said this a couple of months ago, keep going. This is my intentions. I intend to actually achieve this final security situation. And that when we've done that, then we can stop and take breath. It may be that I ask you to hold back, but don't plan on it. Just keep going, and we'll see where we get to. I think the much more interesting question, I think, because I can't think of any logic or evidence to support what Jack Keen's saying, the much more interesting question is, what does the final situation look like for Russia? I think that's a really interesting situation. I'm coming increasingly around to the conclusion that what it probably means is Novorossiya. In other words, it's the some of the territories west of the Dnieper and running through as far as Transnistria. And the reason I say that is you've got broadly speaking, they're either ethnic Russians in those regions or they're Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And furthermore, they all voted politically in a Russian-leaning way. So that's the way that I'd be thinking about it. I would want to secure those areas. It's very interesting that when he talks about buffer zones, he doesn't talk about securing those regions. And those regions that he's talking about, which are up to the north above Sumy, are actually Ukrainian regions, both ethnically and in terms of language. So that's the way I'd be thinking about it. I think I would struggle to do much more with denazification, but you'll end up with a rump state, which you can contain. You've got the western side of the Black Sea secure, which allows you to be a little bit more flexible in terms of the use of naval forces. But also he'll have his eye on Azerbaijan, what's going there and that relationship, and in the Southern Caucasus. He'll want to make sure that he's got the capacity to actually solve that as well, because it looks again like the West could try to make mischief in the Southern Caucasus.
Yeah, that does appear that it's happening. That's definitely on the Russians' mind. Want to make a quick comment there to one of our viewers there to the BT. Said, hey, why don't you get some of these Russian or Ukraine speakers on that say that Ukraine's going to win You would be surprised, but it's been hard for me to get anybody willing to come on the channel to talk about that. We do have some Ukraine folks from their perspective on. We've had some on before. We're trying to get a couple on in the coming couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. But those that say that Ukraine's going to win, I think maybe because they don't think they could stand up to the questioning, they are not willing to come on the show. So it's a little more challenging than you may think. Before we leave the topic here, I want to stick with Keen there, because what he cockily said there at the end was, Putin wants Trump to walk, but guess what? He's not walking away. Okay, then what is he standing for? Because if you're not going to walk away, right now we're doing just like trickle of information. I mean, you heard that Axios reported 10 interceptors that are coming out now. But even aside from that, there's just not many to have. And even when we had the gates wide open and everything was coming out, that also didn't make any difference. So the question being that I would put to Jack Keane, and now I put to you as best you can interpret, I guess, if Trump doesn't walk away, if he doesn't end the facility, but he keeps, all he does is a trickle, where is that going?
It's going to essentially stepping out. It's just trickling out or petering out, as I've said. So I think we're in the middle ground. I mean, frankly, 10 interceptor missiles, it's a joke. I was an air defender, and I can tell you that, to have really good air defense in this situation, you need what we call layered defense. So at sea, but on land, it's the same sort of thing. So you need combat air patrol up there at range, if they're able to get some of the targets. You need a medium range, long range, and medium range SAM, surface-to-air missiles, and then point defense around your key points. It's complicated. It's complicated with 10 targets coming in, with 700 targets coming in. Firing 2 missiles at each. And people talk about very high probability of kill of some of the American missiles against some of the ballistic missiles. I'd be really interesting to see just what they'd look like, because I suspect the PK, the probability of kill, is much, much lower. So, it's almost impossible.
I wanted to ask you something on that. There was a report I read just this afternoon before I went on our previous show, that I think it was CNN actually, that was reporting that the Ukrainians are claiming that there were whatever the number was, 520 or something like that drones and missiles came in overnight, and Ukraine claims that they shot down 487 of the drones and all of the missiles, both Iskanders, KH-101s, and hypersonics, whatever was in that package last night. But I'm like, did they really? Because they're talking about how they need air defense, and we see all these images Gary keeps showing you of all these impacts, and either that's interceptor missiles that missed the target and came down into the cities, or Russian missiles went off target. I can't say, but do they really have the capacity to shoot down all that stuff? Because it seems to me then you're really not that short on air defense. How do you see that from an air defender perspective?
I think it's impossible. I mean, because imagine how you're controlling this, and I mean, to do this, we would do it in operations room or operations room across a number of ships, across a number of areas. It's the same sort of approach on land, but just the sheer volume of weapons coming in, versus the number of batteries you've got, and the decision to hand off targets to combat air patrol. I mean, I very much doubt combat air patrol were involved. So, in a way, that's a little bit of a red herring. But to hand off the targets to the different missile systems, and what they're assuming in that is that we're good at shooting down ballistic missiles. We're not. And hypersonic missiles, I'd be astonished if we've got any capability whatsoever to shoot down a hypersonic missile. I think Ted Prostrov said that some time ago. Yeah. I'd be curious to see what he thought about ballistic missile. But even a ballistic missile is an extremely difficult target to shoot down. I think the THAAD...
about these new Garin drones, the Garin 2s, I think they call them, which some of them are actually jet powered, so they're much faster than the original Garins that came from Iran. What do you use to shoot those down? Is it air defense missiles? Is it Patriots, or is it some other missile system?
Again, I think it depends when you see them and where they are. So if they're close, if they're what I call a pop-up target, so you see it late, then you just use whatever you've got, frankly. I mean, if you see them better, so at longer range, then again, it would tend to be, it might be Patriot. I can't remember what you've got in terms of the other air defense missiles. But it's a medium to long range missile, which is sort of medium. It might be 40 miles. A long range goes out a long way. And if you can get after them, you can. But again, it's just the sheer volume of targets coming in. It's saturation, really. So you're completely saturating the capacity of the air defense system to take down that number of targets. And if they can keep doing that night after night after night, anybody who thinks that they'll stop it, it's a joke, I'm afraid to say.
Well, according to George, that they now have the industrial capacity to maintain that indefinitely. So I guess we'll see pretty soon if that's true or not, if it continues on. But man, the number that have been coming in the last week, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be fascinated to see what Ted thinks about that claim. I suspect that we both know what he thinks, but he'd give us the physics to it. He'd give us the physics of what it's like using missiles to intercept missiles. I mean, you've got to, firstly, you've got to see the missile at range. So you may be getting information from satellite. You then got to hand it on to a target, a radar that actually can illuminate the target. So you've got better definition of where it is. That depends on the missile. Some are semi-active, which means that the target's illuminated by radar and they then follow the radar. Others are independent. So once they know where it is, you fire the missile, it then goes off, and at a certain stage it turns its own radar on and continues the interception. But either way, the simple problem is speed. A subsonic missile coming in at sort of 600 knots is a very difficult target. So a ballistic missile coming in from height, coming in from 60,000 feet or whatever, is an extraordinarily difficult target. I think I heard that there are 60 THAADs, which is theater air defense, which is ballistically capable. But we're talking about $30 million per pop. And they've got the capacity to actually keep firing at those sorts of rates almost for as long as it takes. And there's no way. I'm sure there's no way that
I was told just by a confidential source this past week, or earlier this week, that we produce 24 of those missiles per year.
Per year, yeah. I mean, you could use those in one engagement. So the idea, and again, we don't yet know how good they are. I would imagine they'll be much more capable than others. But even so, as I say, I'd be interested to see what the PK, the probability of kill against a ballistic missile was, and I'd be particularly interested to see what the probability of kill against a hypersonic missile, because my guess is the PK against a hypersonic missile would be very, very low, if they could intercept it at all.
Yeah. And that's the numbers seem to be backing that up. The evidence on the ground certainly does. In the last section here, I want to go over something. So we've talked about what Zelensky's said. We've talked about what the Europeans have said, what the United States, some of the people have said on there too. And then we have the Russians. So what we have the Russians doing is less talk and more action. And so on the battlefield, as we just interviewed somebody just a minute ago that talked about what we can see with our own eyes, which is the Russians are continuing the onslaught in every area of the front. And it's just methodical and relentless. It's going on the ground. Then in the air, we're talking about how it's actually accelerating significantly so, which is going to be, I mean, probably at some point, especially at this rate, they're going to exhaust what's left of the air defense systems even faster than we just can't back it up. So that's a problem. And then there's at the strategic level. And here was Sergei Lavrov. While this conference was going on in Rome about rebuilding something that may never even happen, Sergei Lavrov was talking on the diplomatic and on the economic level about how Russia is deepening its connections to the rest of the world, especially China.
I am confident that we will once again emphasize the central role of ASEAN in developing cooperation mechanisms with the countries that will be represented at these events. We will also talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where our Chinese friends currently hold the chairmanship. BRICS, the G20, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, all of this demands our constant attention.
And certainly they give it, and the attention is received in return, because Russia is setting itself up as a more stable alternative than the Western economic system. And Putin himself at the BRICS meeting earlier this week pointed out that the BRICS plus, which I think is the BRICS plus, I think total of 20 countries, is population wise and GDP wise bigger by a significant portion than the G7 itself. And those things continue to seem to keep growing. So while we're focused on fighting this war here and trying to win the unwinnable, the Russians are succeeding on the battlefield, and they're also setting the conditions later on to keep us in a subordinate position, if you can use that term, economically on the global stage. How do you see that?
The first thing I'd say is that Lavrov, I think, is the standout foreign minister in the world at the moment. He's, having listened to him talking to Larry Johnson, he's able to speak without a script in a way which is almost impossible for any Western foreign minister. I thought that, and this is incidental to your question, but he was insulted by Mark Rutte, the Director General of NATO, what I thought was a shameful thing, talking about how long Lavrov had been a foreign minister. And this is a man, who I would have thought, having been a prime minister of a country, would have thought a little bit better about being a little bit more diplomatic and cautious about the way he's talking. So anyway, that aside, I think that I'm not sure if Russia is trying to put the West down. I think Russia is trying to get away from the West. And I think Russia actually sees, and I suspect they have pretty good evidence for that the global South is also thinking in the same way. And when you look at the way in which, for example, Saudi Arabia are interested in BRICS, other countries are interested in BRICS, and you have to look at it and think, well, if I look at Europe, which would I be more interested? Would I want to join the EU or would I want to join BRICS? I'd join BRICS every time. I'm not saying the countries are all doing perfectly. Then their own ways, they all have economic challenges. We know the housing market in China is an area of economic challenge. We know that inflation in Russia has been an economic challenge. But the fact is, they're doing a lot better than most of the Western countries. China's an open question. I think it's a very interesting question. But the fact is that they're doing a lot better, and Russia in particular is doing a lot better. And it's doing it in a way which is much less aggressive. One of the problems about the West is the aggression that we offer, the bellicosity about you must do this or we will sanction you. You must do this. If you buy oil from Russia, telling countries like India that if they buy oil from Russia that we'll sanction them. It's moronic. It's difficult to think. We're talking about boomerang sanctions again. But it's a sort of level of hubris, which is based, I think, on a true belief that they're actually morally in the right. I don't think they are morally in the right. But even if they were morally in the right, the fact is the balance of power is against them. They're going to lose. So what is it that keeps them moving in a direction where they're talking in this way? Their time will come, and it won't be much fun for them, and it'll be all their own fault. There'll be no excuses for it. And I'd like to think that as the war comes to a close, and the truth starts to emerge, that across the West, there are big questions asked about the way in which the Western leaders conducted this war at both the political and the diplomatic and the military level. What we see is a range of strategic incompetence, which is almost breathtaking.
It is. Yeah, it may be unprecedented in the Western world. I don't know that it's ever been this bad across the board.
And you and I were in Afghanistan. That was bad enough.
Right. I think that's actually looking pretty good by comparison, which is terrifying.
Dear me.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's the state of things right now. And, the whole gist of our channel is that we're unintimidated and uncompromised to bring people the truth, whatever it is. And if that doesn't shine well on us, then we're going to bring that. If it doesn't shine well on Russia, China, Indonesia, anybody else, we're going to bring that to the table here. So people need to know the truth. And once you get enough of the truth out there, then maybe it's a chance that you can course correct before you run off the ship into the rocks. So that's our hope, is that by exposing the truth here, that people can recognize before it's too late. And until that ship hits the rocks, there's always a chance. And that's what we're clinging on to. So thank you so much for coming in and providing such a illumination on this and helping to explain the complicated in a simple way that everybody can understand.
No, it's been a pleasure, Danny. I think it was what we're trying to do is educate our Western publics. And if we can do that, then I think it was Eisenhower who said the most important thing in any democracy is a well-educated public. And at the moment, we have a public who have been deceived.
Yes, by systematically, and we're trying to unwind that. And well, so anyway, we're going to continue on to do that. So thank you very much, and we appreciate you guys. Thank you for being with us today. We had a long day. I think this is our fourth show of the day, one of the most we've had in a long time. So appreciate you being with us, all you guys who were loyal followers. Really appreciate you guys more than you know. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.